Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome to a very special episode of CAF's Warbird Tube. Tonight we're going to talk with best-selling author Adam Makos, whose recent book Devotion was turned into a major motion picture last year. We'll get into that and some of the other highlights of his career so far. But before we do that, please do us a favor. If you haven't already done so, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, hit that follow us button. Just the little bell icon. You'll get new notifications when new episodes of Warbird Tube go live. Joining me now is Adam Makos. Adam, good to see you again. It's been a number of years, but good to be with you again.
Oh, Steve, it's good to see you again. And I love that the Warbird community is small but tight. And we cross paths, and it's like a family after a while. So
that is very
good
true.
To be back with you.
Yeah, I met you and your brother, Brian, at Oshkosh, the EAA fly-in a number of years ago. I think you were still doing Ghost Wings magazine at that time. Is that correct?
We started out with the silliest name for a publication we could have chose. But yeah, Ghost Wings became Valor. And it was amazing because we were looking back, a bunch of kids publishing veteran stories in a homemade magazine, selling sometimes from a card table, and then it kind of grew and grew, and we had such great supports from the community that we were able to make a living at it. And so somehow we're still in this game all these years later.
And your inspiration comes from family. Both of your grandfathers served in World War II.
Yeah, my one grandfather in particular was on B-17s in the Pacific. He was in an emergency rescue squadron, so they were dropping boats, and he was in Nagasaki and flying even in the post-war days. So he used to tell me stories about going up locked and loaded. He was a radio operator, and he would have his .50 caliber ready to go. And I would say, "Well, who are you fighting at that point?" And he would say, "Russian Yaks." He said we had to be ready at all times for attacks from our former allies. So yeah, I grew up with those stories, and just the Warbird bug bit me when I was, 7 years old.
Wow. And what prompted you to write, just start writing at all? I mean, it's kind of an unusual thing for a young man to say, well, I want to write instead of play baseball or football or whatever.
It really was unusual. We were, my brother and my best friend and myself, we were kids in middle school. So I think that puts you at, 14, 13 years old when we decided to start this little homemade newsletter. And it was really brought about by the same reasons that I think a lot of people in the CAF do what they do. We looked around and we saw, in our case, kids in our classrooms knew nothing about this epic and powerful and important war, World War II, or any of our aviation history. And so we said, how do we change this? We love this. We appreciate it. We understand it. How do we begin turning this tide? And so we made this publication mostly to share this passion. And slowly we started getting other kids to read it, and that was cool. And then we had adults subscribing to it, and we knew we were doing something right. And then this amazing thing happened. After maybe 5 years, 6 years of us making our little homemade publication, there was this kind of cultural renaissance when Saving Private Ryan came out, the Greatest Generation book. Suddenly the whole world wakes up to the fact that these World War II veterans are leaving us and that they're very special. And we'd already been doing it for 5 or 6 years. And so we were perfectly positioned to then ride that wave and take our little project further.
So what was your first major book was A Higher Calling. Why did you pick that story?
Well, as we ran our little homemade self-published magazine, and it became a real magazine when we went off to college. I mean, we were printing this thing. It was bound. We were getting advertising. The subscribers were growing. And so over the decade or so that we ran the really good magazine, we came across a lot of stories. So I was the editor, I was also the guy probably putting the magazines in the envelopes and mailing them. So we wore a lot of hats in that job. We worked out of my parents' basement for the longest time, and we would come home from college on the weekends. So totally missed the social life, had no fun whatsoever, but built something really cool. And during all those years of culling stories and chasing leads, one day when I decided to write a book, I wanted something that would last forever. I wanted something that people would put on a bookshelf and it would stay, because a lot of times magazines get recycled. I said, what is the best story I've come across? And there was a story I had done with this old B-17 pilot, Charlie Brown. And it began as a magazine article where I said, I want to tell your story and the story of Stiegler. And he stopped me. He said, Adam, if you want to do this right, he said, I'm not the hero in this. You need to start with the hero. You need to start with Franz Stiegler. He said, but there's a little problem. He's in poor health right now. He's way out in Vancouver. I was living in Pennsylvania at the time. And he said, you're going to have to go out and get him. He said, if I set it up, if I open the door, will you go? Well, when you're fresh out of college and you're looking at the price of an airfare, oh my God, $900 to fly to Vancouver. I'm in Pennsylvania. I'm 23 years old. How am I going to do this? Charlie opened the door and I was fortunate enough to walk through it. And eventually I sat down with Stiegler and I realized, okay, Charlie was right. This guy is the protagonist of this story. And so what began as a magazine article became a 7 to 10 year process working with these veterans, Charlie and Franz. And then one day I said, okay, it's book time. We're there. And that became my first book.
I'm sure everyone should be familiar with the storyline of the book, but just in case, just a brief synopsis.
Oh, it's a great story, and it was one that had already been floating around the aviation world long before I came along. The story first appeared in 1990. It really was, in a nutshell, Charlie Brown was a 21-year-old B-17 pilot on his second mission. His crew, it was their first mission together. And he was limping home, badly damaged. His bomber had one engine out, 2 others damaged. They were trying to get home to England. They were over northern Germany when he made the only mistake that day. He flew over a German airfield. And there was Stiegler on the ground. Stiegler looked up, saw the American bomber, took off, chased it down in his Messerschmitt 109, and was duty-bound to destroy this plane. But when he saw that it was defenseless, nobody was shooting back at him. It was like a ghost ship flying through the sky at about 1,000 feet. Stiegler got curious, and he came up and he saw that the tail gunner was dead. And then he flew alongside of the aircraft, and he saw that the waist guns had been knocked out and the gunners were wounded. And he went all the way up to the cockpit, and he looked inside, and he and Charlie's eyes met. And that day, Stiegler made this incredible choice to not shoot this bomber down. And so the book went into all the detail of how he came to be that man. That was a big question for me. So Franz spares Charlie that day. Later on, these 2 guys find each other. They become best friends. They become fishing buddies. It's this incredible story. And when they reunited and found each other in 1990, the story goes nationwide. It was on, I think, CBS News or one of those network news shows. And people started to report on it. The incredible encounter between these 2 planes. It never went further than that. That's the amazing thing. Nobody ever asked, what did you do before Franz? What was your life like after? Charlie, how did getting spared by a German fighter change your attitude? Now you've got to get back in that B-17. You've got to go fly 23 more missions. How are you ever going to do that after this traumatic encounter? And so I asked the questions that I found nobody else had, which was, how did Stiegler become the man who would spare this bomber? And how did both of these guys go on with the war after that? And it turned out to be one of the most incredible true stories. And there was this part that, Stiegler's memories were 60, 70 years old. And so he would tell me things, and I published them. And there were always these moments where I didn't know if I spelled the name right or if the date was exact. And one time I heard from a guy in Germany, and he said, Adam, I found my uncle's story in your book. My uncle was there was a story of this Messerschmitt 262 pilot. And he crashed in the last days of the war. And Stiegler told me the story. He said, Adam, he was a youngster, and he wanted to fly the 262 before the end of the battle. And I let him take up my plane, and he went and crashed it. And he died in my arms. Well, took it at face value, put it in the book, and a few years later I hear from the nephew of this guy, and he says, my uncle did die in Stiegler's arms. He said, I got to tell you though, Stiegler remembers him as a youngster. He was in his early 20s, so he wasn't as young as the other pilots. He said, but you know that part where Stiegler said that he went after the war and he made this long journey to Graz, Austria, to tell my uncle's mother how he died? He said he really did that. You know, you may doubt this, Adam, you may not believe it, but he actually made this cross-country journey into the British-occupied zone to deliver this last message, a very simple message of your son's last moments, and I was with him to the end. Stiegler just told me that off the cuff. And this guy said this was a huge and epic and important journey for my family. He said, so whatever that man says, you know, take it at gospel because he was telling you the truth. So it's one of those stories that's larger than life, but it hits hard because it's real.
Right. How many times were you able to talk with Mr. Stiegler?
You know, it was on and off for years. I actually spent about, I want to say at least 10 days with him in person in Vancouver. So I forwarded up at this little hotel, and every morning I would go to his house and we would do interviews in the morning, and then he would get tired, so I would go home and have lunch and come back in the afternoon. And it was really something to just sit there on the couch with him and to be talking to this guy who flew with Marseille in the desert, who later on flew with Galland in JV-44, the Squadron of Experts, who had spared this American bomber. And, you know, to see the other side of World War II, which was to really kind of say to yourself, how would you act if your country was suddenly at war with the whole world? You know this crushing wave is coming down on you from the east and the west. You know you've lost in Africa. You know you've lost Italy. You know you've lost at Stalingrad. You know the end is coming. What do you do? How do you carry on? How do you do the honorable thing? And that was this incredible moral quandary that Stiegler faced, and it's what makes his story so great.
Looking back at it, I mean, you said you were 23, 24 years old when you first met Mr. Stiegler. Do you think your relationship with your grandfathers and being able to hear their stories made it easier for you to kind of bridge that pretty substantial age gap between Stiegler and yourself when you were doing those interviews? I mean, how did he know to take you seriously? I mean, we all know to take you seriously now, but at the time you hadn't published, you know, any works yet. How did you bridge that?
Well, you know, Steve, I think part of it is, you know, I had the training wheels on for a long time. So when you start writing about World War II veterans when you're 13 or 14, and you dare to put it in writing and you dare to sell it to other people for 50 cents or whatever, you know, you're learning. And so we just started really young. I think Stiegler, it was really a credit to him because I came to him with very little knowledge of the German side. So Jagdgeschwader, I don't even think I could say it. You know, I would say Marseille, you know, tell me about Marseille. And so I went into this with very little, if any, knowledge of the Luftwaffe in World War II. And, you know, credit to him for bearing with me. But you know what we stuck to were, and I'm kind of glad in the end, we stuck to human stories. Franz, what was it like flying with your brother? His older brother, August, was his mentor and his inspiration. They used to fly gliders together. And then one day when Stiegler was flying for the airlines, his brother was drafted. And his brother went into the military and he decided, I'm going to go the aviation route. His brother becomes a bomber pilot. And his brother's literally at the same base where Stiegler is training others to fly. And Stiegler essentially trains his own brother for war, sends him off, and his brother's flying, I believe it was a Ju-88, and he's killed in France in the early stages of World War II. And so we talked about things like that. We talked about the human things, and we didn't get into the technicalities of the Daimler-Benz engine and which, did you like the G model or the K better? We skipped that stuff, and we just went to the hard-hitting human stuff that nobody had asked him before. And so I got to see the portrait of a man who lost his family, his father and his brother, all of his friends around him, his city, his house, his town, his comrades. A guy who really ended the war with nothing and was getting spit on by the countrymen around him. And that was really eye-opening because nobody ever talks about how a war ends. It's kind of like the movies cut off before then. And so for Stiegler, I was amazed to find that these Luftwaffe pilots were basically blamed for the destruction of Germany. And it kind of fits. It's human nature. Okay, we're going to pick the low-hanging fruit, the easy target. And the German people just turned on these guys and they said, well, our cities are destroyed. It must be because of them. And they had heard the propaganda so much. And guys like Stiegler at the end of the war couldn't find jobs. They were trying to become bricklayers. I worked with another German pilot, Jorg Ciprianka, who was out in California. We lost Jorg about a year ago. And he said, he was fixing sewing machines. I mean, these guys were at 1 minute flying at 27,000 feet above the air in their heated flight suits, and the next moment they're trying to fix sewing machines. They can't get into colleges. Colleges wouldn't let them go back to study. And so it was pretty eye-opening, the journey those guys had, and the fact that they were able to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and somehow live the rest of their lives.
Yeah, amazing. When did he come to the United States? Well, actually, Canada.
Stiegler immigrated to Canada pretty soon after World War II. I want to say it had to be 48, 47. He tried to make it in Germany. He tried to find work, and he just said, this is not working. And a lot of Germans were immigrating to Canada, and he decided to eventually go work in the lumber industry. It was really interesting. It's almost like one of those stories where the hero goes off the grid. He went as far away from civilization as he possibly could. He was working in the Queen Charlotte Islands, fixing lumber equipment, because he was always mechanical, and he'd been around these Messerschmitts and Messerschmitt 262s and 109s, and so he knew how to fly and fix just about anything. So next minute he's out in the woods, and there was always a story about the mascot of Stiegler's squadron was the bear, the Berlin Bear. Berlin was the sponsor of the squadron, the patron city, and this was JG-27, and they had this little bear logo on their cowling of their aircraft. And at one point they had a bear living with the squadron, and Franz really took to this bear, Bobby the bear, and eventually the squadron had to put the bear down at the very end of the war. But Stiegler always had this attachment to his bear. And his wife, Haya, once told me when she moved over from Germany and married him, and they were living on the islands together. And one night they were walking home from a party where, the lumberjacks were holding a party. Mm-hmm. And Franz had had a few beers, maybe one too many, and a bear and her cubs stepped out of the brush on the wood, out of the woods on the road that Stiegler and his wife were walking on. Usually you don't want to run into a mama bear and her cubs in the dark after you've had a few beers. Big mistake. And Stiegler saw this bear, and in his state of mind, he said, "Oh my God, it's my bear. It's Bobby." And just started going for the bear, just to hug it, because they used to swim with this bear. It used to live with him in his apartment at times, and so his wife had to literally kick him behind his legs, drop him to the ground, and pull him away, because he was going to go give the bear a hug in the middle of the night. Little stories like that, but then you think to yourself, "Oh man, that was their mascot," and somebody had to put a bullet in his head. Pretty heavy stuff.
Well, and I think you touched on this earlier, and I think it's one of the great successes of your writing is that being able to put the human element into it. It's one thing to, as you said, talk about the nuts and bolts of the Mercedes-Benz engine, or how many rivets are in the wing of a ME-109 or a P-51 Mustang, and there's folks who do a great job of recording and digging up those kinds of technical issues. But I really think your publications, your books, because they center so much on the human element, bring us a different dimension. It's not as easy. It's not as easy to look at who won and who lost as who is impacted on either side. And I really enjoy that about your writing.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that everybody in the CAF understands that same thing, that the machine matters, the details of the machine and all the little pieces, nuts and bolts that go into it are a work of art. These machines are absolute flying art, but they wouldn't be what they are if it wasn't for the people who are flying them. So it's this true 50-50. And I think we're all enamored by by those people who dare to put on the straps and take these machines into the sky. You're taking a human-built aircraft and going where most of the world has never been. And yeah, I think we're all in awe of those people. And so it's kind of it's a true 50-50. Amazement at the machines and awe of the people.
Good. What was your reaction as people started reacting to the higher call? I guess when you put the book out, were you expecting lots of people to say, "Wow, this is great, I want to read it," or just kind of, as you said, put it there that's something that would be there for all of time?
You know, Steve, I really thought I was going to get destroyed on my first book. You know, it was the kind of thing where I thought, number one, we've taken a huge risk in basing the story around a good German. This was 2012, and you know, the climate then was not so different from the climate now. It was just still the idea that the Germans were, you know, they were universally evil. And I don't think really anybody other than Das Boot, you know, back in the 80s, there had been very few attempts to show the other side. And so it was a big risk. And I just thought, okay, you know, the reviews on Amazon, I'm going to get destroyed for this. But I said, you know, you got to take that chance. Stiegler really did something amazing that day. And if I don't show his journey, I've done a disservice to the story. And instead, I saw this sort of universal acceptance and appreciation for it from everybody. The only people who don't like the story, funny enough, are the ones who saw, sometimes you find this in Germany, very, 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 very far-right elements look at it and they say, Stiegler betrayed his country. You know, he should have shot that bomber down. And so they don't look at it and say, wow, there's a good German fighter pilot in a book about him, you know, the guy who did the right thing. They see it as having done the wrong thing. He should have shot that bomber down. That bomber went back and it destroyed more German cities and it destroyed more German people. You know, Franz essentially allowed Charlie to continue his war of, in their minds, aggression against the German people. And so, you know, you're talking 1% of 1% of 1% would see that story this way and not like it. Everybody else was pretty cool about it. And the story just took off. It came out on around December 20th, which was the anniversary of this incredible encounter between the men. Great timing. Usually, though, a publisher doesn't put a book out then. Usually, if you want your book to succeed, you put your book out before Christmas so people can buy it as gifts.
Yes.
Nobody really knew what this book was going to do. And so they had printed 5,000 copies, I believe. They put it out a few days before Christmas. And it was kind of like, let's just see what happens. Every copy sells out in just a few minutes. And it becomes the Tickle Me Elmo of that Christmas season where you could not find them. People were literally beating down doors. Do you have a copy here? I'm willing to drive 2 hours to get it. The story burst. It burst on NPR. It went on the AP web. It just started taking off. And so for those 4 days, I had the most frustrating time in my life because I'm getting calls and calls and calls. Where can we get this book? And everybody at the publisher's already gone on vacation. Mm-hmm. And I just had to sit back and say, okay, let's see where this wave goes after Christmas. And it just continued and continued. And so it's one of the most beloved aviation books. And I don't sit around and say, oh, it was because I wrote a great book. You know, this story is 90% of the battle. You know, it's the author's 10% to just not mess it up.
There you go. How long did it take from that first interview with Franz Stiegler until it was actually published? What was that time frame?
That was, oh gosh. You know, we did 2 magazine articles together. We did an art print. My family has a small art publishing company called Valor Studios. And that's always how we've kind of kept the lights on and paid the bills. You just can't go off and write a book and disappear for a year and expect to have an income. So we have our magazine eventually ended, and Valor Studios continued it. We publish historical artwork. So we publish these beautiful prints of aviation scenes signed by the heroes who were there. Well, along the way, I did a painting with Stiegler and Brown, and never knowing how incredible that would become. So one day we make these limited edition prints, and they are signed by Charlie and Franz, and they signed them out in Minneapolis at the Air Expo event. And I traveled across the country, and we did that. We were selling these things for $200, $245, which was pretty cool. And they're flying out the door. Everybody wants this print because they knew this story. Now those things, $2,000, $2,500. I mean, just they're cherished items. And so it's kind of cool to have this little side business that celebrates heroes, and it's all storytelling. The artwork on the wall behind you, you know, you look at that, it's a physical reminder of these people we appreciate. So it's all in the same vein.
What came after Higher Calling?
You know, after that, we hurried to press a book about the Marines in the Pacific called Voices of the Pacific. I'm really proud of that because those stories absolutely needed to be told. So it was a collection of oral histories from Marine Corps veterans who fought the Japanese. Then I dove into this book, Devotion, and I had already been kind of working on at any given time, I'm already working on the next 2 books. So I'm already talking to the next 2 heroes. I'm already researching them. It's every book becomes about a 5-year process at the minimum. So I'd been working on this book with Tom Hudner while I was working on A Higher Call. Tom Hudner was this incredible hero I met one day at an event in Washington, D.C. I was working for my magazine, and I heard him speak at a conference. And when I was leaving, I saw him in the hotel lobby. Tom was a Medal of Honor recipient in the Korean War, a Navy Corsair pilot who had done this incredible act of heroism himself. And I saw Tom there with this newspaper, and I had my luggage. I was ready to go home. I said, oh, it's now or never. This is Captain Tom Hudner. It was like seeing the Rolling Stones sitting in the lobby of a hotel and nobody knows, you know, Mick Jagger or Ronnie Wood. And so I said, okay, I'm gonna do this. So I went over and I approached him. I said, Captain Hudner, I heard you speak, and I would love to tell your story if you'd grant me an interview. And that day he took out his business card. He said, why, sure, call me. He changed my life because it was this amazing story about December 1950. His flight leader, Jesse Brown, who happened to be the first black naval aviator, had been shot down behind enemy lines in North Korea during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. Jesse was trapped in his aircraft. It was catching on fire. It looked like he was going to burn to death. He couldn't get out of the cockpit. The aircraft was too badly mangled in the crash. And he was going to die alone, far from home, behind enemy lines. And that's when Tom did this incredible event that had never happened before. It has never happened since. He decided to intentionally crash land his aircraft to try to save his friend. Jesse had crashed in the mountains, pretty much in a small plateau on the top of a mountain. And so what Tom did that day was absolutely astounding. He made a carrier landing on a mountaintop. And he got out into the snow, and his first thought was, what am I doing here? And then he remembered, I've got to try to do something for Jesse. And he launched this incredible rescue mission to try to save his friend. And it just was too good to just be a magazine article. And so Tom and I embarked on a book, and that was, when was that? 2007 I met him, I think. So that goes back a long ways.
And this being, this is a little bit out of your wheelhouse. You had been centered on World War II, now suddenly in the Korean War. But it really, it's amazing because it's a story that I had heard, but never really registered. It was one of those that, oh, yeah, I heard about that. Until you read the book. And then you, again, get into the human interaction between the two of them and all the things that were happening, in the military in the 50s, being in Korea, the conditions there, and then also, seriously, a lot of prejudicial people still in the military, and Tom was not one of those. And when you read the book, you see Jesse takes a while to actually realize this is someone who could actually be a friend.
Mm-hmm. Steve, it struck me as another story of two men from different worlds, and that's what the Stiegler-Brown story was about. It was about an American and German who become brothers and friends, and after fighting each other almost quite literally. And in this case, the story of Tom Hudner, who was from the country club scene of New England. Tom was from a well-to-do family. They owned the Hudner's Markets, which was a series of about 7 grocery stores at the time. Jesse Brown grew up in segregation. He was from Mississippi. He was the son of a sharecropper, quite literally working the fields barefoot and watching aircraft fly over and having this crazy idea that someday he could be a pilot in a country that really didn't love him or want him. And so these men were literally from different worlds, even if it was within the same, contiguous United States. Mm-hmm. And that story that spoke to me. The fact that it was set in the Korean War was both a bit of a hurdle and a gift. It was a gift in that if this story had happened in World War II, many people would have written this book long before me. If Jesse Brown had crashed if he had been a Tuskegee Airman who crashed behind the lines in Yugoslavia or in Austria, and a fellow Mustang pilot had crashed his plane to try to save him, that would already be a movie. I mean, it would have been a movie back in 1946. The fact that it was a Korean War, nobody knows anything about that. It was a war we were quick to pack away. All we had for all those decades was MASH. And so other writers just didn't go for this story. But really, I mean, the Korean War is fascinating in that, we're using the same weapons of World War II, same aircraft, literally the same bullets, the same guns, the same tanks. We're fighting a former enemy or former ally in a sense. We're fighting Russia. It was a proxy war. They were using their jets against us, their anti-aircraft. They were supplying the North Koreans. They were drawing up the battle plans. They gave the order to attack South Korea. Russians had their hands in everything. So did the Chinese. Their Chinese troops were these guys that we literally were fighting for, to beat back the Japanese. Now they're taking old American guns that they were using and they're using them against us. And so it was just this amazing story of how the allies of World War II turned against each other, and they're fighting in the case of Devotion. We follow this really fascinating battle, the Chosin Reservoir, and I really found it to be an intriguing battle because it's the U.S. Marine Corps fighting in the snow. These guys are literally wearing the same camouflage helmet covers that they were using on Peleliu and Tarawa, and now they're fighting in North Korea. And that alone is fascinating. The idea of how does the U.S. Marine Corps wind up in North Korea in sub-zero temperatures. And in this case, they wound up surrounded, about 20,000 U.S. Marines surrounded by about 120,000 Chinese communist troops. And they're surrounded in this big valley at the Chosin Reservoir, this man-made lake. And how they survived this battle, there were small army units attached as well, but how these guys, completely encircled, came out of there alive. I mean, this is like Valley Forge, this is like the Battle of the Bulge, and yet people had never studied this. And that's where Jesse Brown made his sacrifice, and that's where Tom Hudner made his heroic gesture. And the key to the survival of the Marines at that battle was air power. Right. And so you could argue when you study it, and we go into this in Devotion, the application of close air support at the Chosin Reservoir was unlike any other time in history, because you had really developed ground-to-air communication. So you had forward air controllers, Marine aviators, on the ground in the jeeps with these columns of Marines who are getting sniped at from the hills and who are surrounded, and they're calling in air support in a way it's never been done in history. And so there are stories where you'd see some of these Navy squadrons, and they were keeping kill counts after a mission, and they would say, we claim 1,000 enemies today, and then others 2,000. I mean, they were dropping napalm, they were shooting, they were strafing, and then one pilot told me, he said, we were going so low, we were trying to chop them with our propellers. It was that desperate, and the close air support was that powerful, and in the end, it took what should have been the annihilation of the 1st Marine Division. They were calling them the Lost Legion. The American newspapers were saying the Lost Legion in North Korea, preparing us for the loss of all these guys. Somehow they marched out of there. And it turns out to be one of the cool stories of the Korean War. So forget the fact that it's fought in 1950 and it's fought far, far away from romantic Normandy, France, or Bastogne, Belgium. This was an incredible battle and a fascinating one.
Indeed, and centered around Thomas Hudner and Jesse Brown. They're the linchpin of the book, but there's so much more that goes around it that sets you in that time, in that period, and really, as you said, the desperation that the Marines had to feel, just almost cut off and hoping beyond hope that something good would happen, and then to have the air support come in and really help them to be able to break out and survive. How many different folks or interviews did you end up doing for Devotion?
You know, by the time it
in
was
general
done,
terms.
yeah, I would say you're talking in the dozens.
Yeah.
Interviewing the Marines who were there, interviewing the pilots, and it's amazing that the book came out in 2015, and within 2 years, everybody was gone.
Yeah.
The Korean War generation disappeared just like the World War II one has. And so of that fighter squadron, there's nobody left. Of the Marines I wrote about, there's none of them left. And so I was lucky, though, at the time, the guys were still there. And so I could call them up and say, hey, what was your reaction to this and what was your reaction to that? And that's always been one of the secrets of my stories. I've just based them so much around the real people that it brings the heart and the soul, and you're able to get into their heads and you can hear what they said and did. And it's because I've had these great relationships with Tom Hudner and Marty Good and Red Parkinson, the Marine on the ground. And so, you pick up a lot of dear friends and you take their story and you try to bring it to the world. And when people read it, you accomplished everything you set out to do. You know that those names will live on forever. And there is that quote that says, a person can die twice. The first time is when they physically die, but the second is the last time their name is spoken. And for Tom Hudner and Jesse Brown, Tom was a Medal of Honor recipient, so there's always going to be that, I knew Tom Hudner, he was a nice guy, and he was a great friend, and he helped out with this charity and that charity. But I really feel like his wartime exploits were in danger of being forgotten. Mm-hmm. He would be just another Medal of Honor recipient in that forgotten war who did something, and here's going to be the citation that'll appear in every book about it. We're just going to read the same thing over and over again, and nobody's ever going to really care who he was or what he did. And we were able to head that off. We were able to prevent that. And so now he lives on in this fat 400-page book, and now in a movie, by God's grace, it was made and it's out there.
Yeah. Before the movie was made, though, you and Tom actually made a trip to North Korea to try to fulfill his last promise to Jesse Brown.
That was pretty wild. I was working on the book where Tom leaves Jesse on the mountainside and he says goodbye to him, essentially. And he said something unusual that day. He said, "We'll be back for you. I'll be back." And when I got there, I had asked Tom, why would you say that? And see, the thing is, at that point in the Chosin Reservoir battle, nobody thought we were going to lose this battle. Nobody thought we were going to, yield the ground to the enemy. And in the case of our Marines and Army soldiers, that they would retreat to the coast, board ships, be taken to the south, re-equipped to fight again that winter. Nobody thought that would happen. So Tom thought he's going back in a helicopter to the base. They're going to get a torch. They're going to get some more men. Maybe they'll get another helicopter. Let's all get back here. And let's get him out tonight. Let's get him out tomorrow morning. Whatever happens, he didn't see it ending the way it did. And so when I got to that part in the book, I remembered I was writing it late at night. And it must have been the next day. I called him up and I said, "Tom, did you ever get to go back to North Korea? You made that promise. You were in the Navy the rest of your life." And he said, "No, Adam." He's like, "We didn't have diplomatic relations. There was never a moment where I was doing a war bond tour in South Korea and I could walk across the border. It was just never a possibility, even in a diplomatic sense. Even there was no opportunity for him." And I said, "Well, would you go?" And I think the reason I wanted to do it was I had seen how Stiegler and Brown found each other after decades and decades, and so nothing seemed impossible. If two men who only knew each other's faces, who met in the air over Germany in the middle of World War II, could somehow find each other 60 years later, I thought, well, maybe we can find Jesse Brown. And so when Tom agreed to do it, I was stunned. And we put together a party that went first to China, and then we got our visas into North Korea. When you land in North Korea, you hand over your U.S. passport. You won't see it again until the end of the trip. There is no U.S. embassy. They tell you, if you have trouble, go to the Swedish embassy. But you really are taking a big leap of faith. And in this case, Tom Hudner being there, the Medal of Honor around his neck, and our hosts were unusual. A lot of people, when they go to North Korea, if you go as a tourist or as a journalist, you're hosted by essentially the Foreign Affairs division of the communist government. We were hosted by the North Korean Army. And so that was really interesting that the guys who picked us up at the airport in their suits later on, a couple hours later, when we had our first meeting, they show up in their uniforms, with the shoulder boards, with the red ornaments, and they're in the green pressed uniforms. And these guys suddenly looked really tough and really scary. And they were all of the rank of colonel or so. So they're all pretty high-ranking guys. There were a few majors, but they turned out to be our hosts, but they also, oddly enough, kind of became our friends. After 10 days of traveling the country together. Now, our goal was to go to find Jesse Brown's crash site. We wanted to be the first Westerners back to the Chosin Reservoir, aside from the JPAC teams that have gone looking for remains at the intermittent moments where we've kind of cooperated with the North Koreans and they've cooperated with us. That's happened a few times since the war, but largely it's been a stalled process. So we thought, okay, we're going to be literally the first guys to go to the Chosin Reservoir. But then when we're flying into the country, we see the monsoons had hit. Bridges were being washed away. North Korean soldiers were standing by the side of the road with sandbags. You'd see masses of people, thousands of men putting sandbags at the levees. We drove through the countryside, and you would see a park that would have a dragon in the middle of it, like a big ornamental dragon, and it had become a sea serpent. You could just see the humps of the dragon because the water had risen 6 feet in the park. So we saw the country was swamped, and there was no way we were getting to the Chosin. We even asked if we could go by helicopter, and they said we can't go by helicopter because our landing strip where our people are, who have the tents and the stuff you were going to use, the landing strip's been washed away. And so we could see with our own eyes they were telling us the truth. So we became essentially guests of theirs for that time. And so it was just amazing. Every night sitting with the North Korean army around a big table with a big stir-fry wok in the middle, and your food is brought to you, the vegetables and the meats, and you are dipping your food in the same wok and you're stir-frying it across from a North Korean colonel. And then we're drinking soju, and nobody would think that they actually have really good beer. The North Koreans have some of the most pure spring water from their mountains, which are not necessarily polluted by industry. And so they're very proud of the clarity of their water and the wheat that goes into their beer. And they make one of the most incredible Hefeweizens on the planet. Maybe an import opportunity there someday. But you see that those guys respected his uniform, and they wanted to get to know us. And they said, can I come with you to Denver? At the time I lived in Denver. They said, can I come visit you? Can I come golfing after this? And I said, sure, yeah, I'm open to that. And he said, trick question. He said, we can't come. Your country won't let us visit. They said, you'll let the Chinese come. You'll let the Chinese military come into your country and meet with you. And at the time, back when we did this, gosh, it had to be 2013. I think. Yeah, the book came out 2015. Mm-hmm. This was about 2 years before. We had different relations with China where their military, we would have exchange programs where we're talking to them. And so the North Koreans, given the chance, they would have loved to have come golfing in Colorado. And I don't mean that they're going to sneak around and steal our secrets from Peterson Air Force Base. They literally wanted to come golfing because North Koreans trace their roots to the Wild West. Believe it or not. They wanted to see Colorado. They wanted to see Texas. They wanted to see the Wild West because the North Koreans believe that our Native Americans are from North Korea. They believe that in the polar age, they crossed the land bridge, and that what we would say are Native Americans, indigenous people, are actually their indigenous people. Ah. And so they have an affinity with cowboys and Indians, as you might say, in a way that we would never imagine, that the Wild West era that was part of our history. So yeah, it was an interesting experience to realize that at the end of the day, we're all human. We all want the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that really nobody, not even the North Korean military, none of them really want a war with the United States or with the South. That's left to the leaders of the countries that get us into these things. And the only way to find that out was to literally sit down with one of America's arch enemies right now. And it was kind of sad to walk away from that too.
Were there any points in that trip where you felt uncomfortable, or, obviously handing over your passport has got to be one, but were there any others, or it was a pretty smooth process?
I think sometimes you don't know. There's like an ignorance is bliss. So not knowing what was said behind the curtains. You know, we know our rooms were probably being surveilled from the hotel room next door to us. You know, you knew you were being watched, and there was a part where we knew that they were on the ball. When it came time to leave, they pulled us off the bus, and they had everybody get their suitcases out, and they're just it's that sort of pandemonium of something's wrong, and everybody's shouting, and you hear the North Korean voice, and you're like, they're not going to let us go. What happened? And they grab Hudner's luggage, and Tom opens it up. And he had taken one of the hangers from the closet. And he must have had his suit on it, and he put it in his suitcase. They noticed that a hanger was missing from the hotel room. He had stolen a hanger. Now, we know it was a mistake. He had just put it in there. He was 88 years old. But, you know, when that young American had taken a North Korean flag, and they caught him doing that, we saw how that ended. He was imprisoned. He eventually contracted, I believe, a meningitis that affected his brain, and he died by the time he got home to the States. And so even a couple months after, maybe it was a year after we were there, an American serviceman had gone back foolishly to try to reunite with some of the guerrillas that he had fought with during the war. He had been essentially a special forces officer during the Korean War. And he was going to try to find some of his North Korean guerrillas. Absolutely insane mission, and I don't know why he did it. But he was interned, captured. He got out barely. So sometimes you don't know what danger you're in until you're really in danger. And one thing was, when we were flying home, we got on this Soviet airliner, and it was a high-wing aircraft with 2 jet engines. It was a pretty nice aircraft. So we're flying back to China. That's the only way in and out. Beijing has a flight, a couple times a week into Pyongyang. And so we're at, 25,000 feet, and you're just, okay, please just steer straight. And suddenly this plane just banks on a wing at this incredibly high altitude, which, it made me a little uncomfortable. And it starts circling, cutting a knife's edge in the middle of the sky, this tight turn. And I'm like, oh, okay, are we going back now to Pyongyang? Did they find another hangar missing? And then the pilots come on the radio, and they're saying something. And then we realize that we were flying over the birthplace of Kim Il-sung, the leader and great father of their country. And so you're supposed to look out the window and look down through the clouds and salute the dear leader. Mm-hmm. But man, it's just, that was one of those moments where you don't want to see your 767 go up on a knife's edge at 25,000 feet and start flying over Mount Vernon, and that's essentially what they were doing. So when that plane leveled out and went into Beijing, and when we saw the little Chinese kids coming through customs and handing them our passports, and they had this little bar where once they processed you, it would come up with 3 faces. One was a green smiley face. The middle one was a yellow semi-content face. The other one was a red angry face. How did we do? And everybody was just mashing that green button. Let us into China. Let us into China. Yep. It was something.
What was Mr. Hudner's reaction to the trip? Did he have any thoughts or recollections that kind of stood out or that he shared?
Tom was kind of this kind of quiet, silent, strong hero who just saw it as something he owed his friend Jesse, the last full measure of devotion. And so he didn't reflect a lot on the trip, honestly. He said it was a job to be done, and we tried our best. And he hoped that someday, and what happened was, I think he was more or less frustrated, because when we came home, we wrote to John Kerry at the time, and we told him, because the whole U.S. government was following our trip, and we told him, hey, the North Koreans say they can find Jesse Brown. They asked us to come back in the fall. We'll go in the autumn. They said we'll go trout fishing in the chosen reservoir, and we'll go look for Jesse Brown. We know the mountaintop where Jesse Brown's remains are. We know pretty much where he's buried. he would have been buried in one of the bomb craters there. After the war, after the battle, American aircraft came over and dropped some iron bombs to destroy Hudner's aircraft. So it couldn't be, in the movie it says, so they can't get the Corsair. Well, not really. The North Koreans pulled a couple Corsairs out of lakes. They had Corsairs. We were just trying to hide the IFF devices. And so we know where Jesse is buried. He was buried in one of those bomb craters because that's what happens in Southeast Asia. When they go in the Vietnam to find Vietnam era remains, the peasants usually bury the American pilots in the natural grave, which is the hole where either the plane went in or, in Jesse's case, in the bomb crater nearby. So we know where he is. And the North Koreans said, come back. Now, that's a big thing to tell an 88-year-old man come back a couple months later, travel across the whole world. But we were willing to do it. And I think Tom was willing to do it. And at the very least, we would have gone without him. And the message from our government was, no thank you. The North Koreans are opaque and intransigent. And until they abandon their nuclear weapons program, we will have no dealings with them. So I felt like it was, when you think the American government can't be any more, I don't know, self-assured, let's say. They go and say that, which was, we're not going to send over a team to look for the remains of an American serviceman. We're not going to look for an opportunity to build a bridge. We're not going to look for common ground. We're not going to do the smallest thing together until you abandon your nuclear program. Well, that's why Jesse Brown is still there, because, our follow-up trip was effectively denied, and I think we could have found him. So, I also believe in timing, though, Steve, and that is sometimes a story or an event, you have to wait for its time. And Jesse Brown's time we weren't meant to find him in 2013. Hopefully that day is still coming, but it wasn't the right time.
What was the process? The book has been published. What's the process of it becoming a movie? I mean, there's so many books and so many stories, and we've heard this before. Someone will say, wow, that was a really great book. Somebody should make that into a movie. So for every 10 of those, one gets treatment like yours. But how did that process happen?
It's like you said, it's a rare occurrence. And I think everybody thinks when they write a book, including myself, that someday it'll become a movie. I mean, we all dream big, and we all think, oh, of course everybody loves this story as much as I do. People have said, why hasn't A Higher Call become a movie yet? And I would argue, why have a lot of stories not become movies yet? Why haven't we had a World War II submarine movie in a while? Why haven't we had this or that? And the reality of Hollywood is, and it's a terrible thing, and if somebody out there watching this has $50 million in their bank account that they'd like to either give to the CAF or donate to a film, we'd love to talk to them, because it really comes down to who is willing to open up their pocketbook to fund a movie about a bygone era, something that'll be very expensive and that may never make a penny. It's almost, you have better odds really going to Vegas than sometimes you do making a movie. And so that's really what it comes down to. Studios these days, they want to make movies that, number one, either suit their worldview, which I think is upside down, or they want to make things that they know are a sure hit. Okay, comic book movies. The good old historic epics, they play to a certain audience. You're not going to get the under 18s going to see that. Your audience is 30 to 70, and they are no longer necessarily going to movie theaters. And so the whole industry has been turned upside down. But even before that, just trying to get somebody to believe in a good old-fashioned war movie has become an uphill battle. So to get a movie made it's actually more like probably a 1 in 1,000. And the only way Devotion got made was because Mr. Fred Smith, the founder and former CEO of FedEx, was a Marine himself in Vietnam. He has a Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts. And he had heard this story from his NCOs when he was coming up the ladder as a young lieutenant in K-35, which was a Marine rifle company. And he had heard the story. He had sat next to Tom Hudner at a dinner. And when the book was brought to him, he said, I know this, and this is an important story. Nobody else knows the story of Hudner and Brown and Jesse Brown's incredible pioneering spirit. And he said, I want to get behind this. And so his daughters were in the film industry, they're producers. And that one man believed in this, where 99% of Hollywood, the power brokers, did not, or would not, and would never believe in it. So, really it was like lightning striking. And he said, I want to make this movie, and if I have to pay for it myself, I'm going to do it. And he did. And Devotion, I knew it was going to be an incredible film when I went to the set. And you get there about 5 a.m, and in this case, it was in Georgia, on an airfield in Georgia. And you walk out, and the fog is clearing, and the sun is lifting, and you walk across this old airfield, an Air National Guard base, and there's an aircraft carrier looming in the mist. They had literally built the superstructure of the USS Leyte on the side of a runway. And I walked up, and you're looking up, and it's several stories tall, and you walk up and you bang on it. That's the first thing you do. And you find out it's made of metal. And there are Corsairs taxiing by, and there goes Steve Hinton in a Corsair, and that's when it comes to life, and you realize that they made a big and beautiful movie, and they used real planes, and they wanted to have these aircraft flying off of the closest thing to a carrier, but you can't do that in Corpus Christi as easily as they did in Pearl Harbor. You can't do that in Charleston, or wherever else they have the carriers. Yeah, the Yorktowns in Charleston. And so you can't be flying Corsairs off of carriers in populated harbors. So they built their own aircraft carrier in the middle of a field in Georgia.
Amazing. How involved were you in developing the screenplay for the movie?
Ultimately, I was given the chance to look it over and make some notes. And, with these kind of things, usually an author is not even given that opportunity. Usually when you sign on the dotted line, you sign a 40-page contract that says you essentially waiver all rights of participation. So they can fictionalize, they can do whatever they want. And that happens with pretty much every book contract, with every film. And in my case, the fact that they let me see the script and I was able to say, hey, Brown would have said this, or Hudner would have done this, or I got to weigh in. And ultimately, it's their vision of the story. It's theirs. They really took the biggest risk, and that is, yes, I wrote a book that took me a decade or more of my life, but they laid out $90 million. And, when you're betting, when the stakes are that high, it comes down to a pecking order of, who's got the most to lose. And at the end of the day, the author is not the one with the most to lose. And so at the end of the day, creative control belongs to them, and rightfully so.
As you mentioned, it's I think a 400 or so page book. So there's a lot of content which needs to be kind of squeezed down for the big screen. Overall, were you pleased with how it went from being the book to the screenplay and the eventual movie?
Absolutely. I believe when you sit in the theater, I saw the movie, I want to say 7 times, maybe 8 times in theater. And it would never get old, because as soon as they would fire up the engines of the Bearcats and they would take off, and you're seeing these, that was one of my favorite sequences, because it's like watching a dance of these 2 aircraft. And it's just like you imagined it. It's just like when you wrote it, because to write something, you first have to see it here. You take the facts in the interviews, and then you process it through this thing, and then you put it on paper or on a keyboard. And that chase sequence, just like it played out on paper. Same with the Yalu Bridge attack. I mean, when it looks like the way the veterans described it, and it goes down largely like they described it, you're getting to see a real moment in history. And one of the best ways I put my feelings for this film, Joe Jonas is one of the characters in it. He is a pop star who is a singer in the Jonas Brothers, the 3 brothers that have a band. And Joe played Marty Good, one of the pilots in VF-32. And he said to one of the producers, I want to take a stab at a music video. I want to make a song for this. And I know anytime that an artist says that, the producers are kind of probably wondering, are we going into dangerous waters here? Is it going to be good? He wrote this song, and it was incredible. And it became the end credits for the film. So you hear this song about it's called "You Are Not Alone," and it was up for it was on the short list to be an Oscar nominated song. All that to say, Joe Jonas went and made a music video, and they flew the Corsair down from the Erickson Museum. It was Jesse Brown's 211, and he's singing this song with another pop star named Khalid, and they're singing this on the wing of a Corsair. So he's sitting on the wing root, they're in a hangar, and so you see these pop stars singing about something from the Korean War in front of a Corsair in a hangar in Van Nuys or in Chino, and you say to yourself, okay, if I could go back and somebody said to me, Joe Jonas wants to make a music video and song about your book, it's going to be 2.5 minutes long. I would have said, oh my God, this was all worth it. It was the greatest outcome you could hope for, because you took a story that became a book and now you've reached more people. You've reached some teenage girls that are going to follow this, or you reach, the song's been watched by millions. I would have done it just for the music video. I did it without that, but if you put it in context, a 2-minute music video would have been perfectly wonderful. To get a 2-hour and 20-minute movie about the Korean War, about these heroes, every second of that film is really a gift.
Yeah. Is there a favorite memory that stands out during the production? Were you there for all of it, or just sporadically during the filming?
They actually filmed it during COVID, which was really audacious and brave of them. And I know they had to spend a fortune in the COVID testing. It was I don't want to say millions per day or $1 million a day, but when you boiled it down, it was, more than we can imagine. You could probably buy a new B-17 for what they spent on the COVID testing. I got to visit it intermittently to be involved. Favorite part, though? There were a lot of favorite parts. When they did the Hollywood premiere, they trucked a Corsair through the streets of Los Angeles. It was the one from Erickson. Mike Oliver brought it down, and Jim Martinelli rigged up this way they were going to... And they towed it through the streets of L.A. At one point, one of the tires went flat. They had to replace a tire in the middle of... underneath the highway. And they brought this Corsair all the way into West Hollywood, into this neighborhood, and they parked it at the end of the red carpet. And so that's the moment where I went to the red carpet before it began, just to kind of get a lay of the land. And you look and you see all the lights being set up, and you see the bleachers for the press, and you see the marquee, and then you see this Corsair at the end. And that was just a moment where you say, okay, Tom was gone at that point, but you say, hey, Tom, we did something good. End of story.
Awesome. Well, what is next for you? If you can look under the covers a little bit without giving away too much.
Yeah, it's I never know when I'm allowed to talk about what's next, but I've been working on a book. Mr. Fred Smith had turned me on to a story when I was traveling with him for devotion, and he said, Adam, there's a story you've got to look into, set in World War II, involving the mission Ploesti. And he turned me on to the story of an incredible American bomber crew, and they fly the B-24 bomber. I don't know if you know anybody who has any of those, but
we might be able to hook you up.
I might need it someday. I hope. But it's an incredible story about B-24s, and my favorite part of this is that I would have thought the story of A Higher Call with Stiegler and Brown was, I would have thought that was the end of it. But would you believe that there's a story of another enemy ace and an American bomber crew, and they're from the 8th Air Force, and he's flying a Messerschmitt, and somehow these guys come around, and there's a friendship between enemies, and it happened twice. Yeah, it's that kind of story. So I've got one more. I'm finishing. I'm deep in the book now. I've been into it for about 5 years now, and so I think we got it. It'll be coming out in the months and maybe in the next year or two. But yeah, we're going back to World War II. Did the Korean War thing. Wrote a book called Spearhead about the American tankers in Europe. About the first tank into the city of Cologne and the battles there. And again, a friendship between enemies. Story of an American tank gunner and the German tank gunner he fought against, who later on become friends. Never thought it could happen. Lightning could strike this many times, but yeah, now we've got the pilot and the enemy ace, and one of the greatest escapes of World War II.
Awesome. You mentioned, and this is just absolute curiosity that just popped into my head. Do you write longhand on paper first? Do you do typewriter? I know some writers use typewriters because that's old school, or just go right to the keyboard and computer.
What I would say to anybody who's ever wanted to write a book or write an article, even for your newsletter or magazine, it's writing is not as sexy as they make it in the movies. In the movies, they show an inspired author sitting in a park with pen and paper, and he's sitting at his desk pounding away on his typewriter late at night. And the reality is, it's a lot more sloppy than that. It's a lot more mechanical, and that is, you're taking these facts and figures and you're reworking them, and you're taking a thought you wrote, and the next day you're rewriting it 5 times. Nothing is beautiful and poetic as first line leads to second, leads to third. And so if anybody wants to write anything good, at least maybe I'm not so good at it, but I have to rewrite everything about 20 times. It's a process of, you throw something on paper and you refine it. Just like it's like a statue. You start with big cuts and then you start to make the small ones at the very end. But it's a process where nobody gets it right the first time, and that you're better off if you've got a story to tell. Write down all your facts, write down your anecdotes, start to finish, and then if you want, work backwards. If you want, go back to the beginning. But never think that you have to have the perfect first line, then the perfect second line, then the perfect third line. That's a bunch of nonsense. Jump to the end and write the last line, then write the middle line, then jump to the front. It's a practical thing, and so I'm still learning though as I go.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I think if I had a final thought, it's that I've been very fortunate since I was young. I was allowed by a lot of Warbird pilots to camp under their B-17s. So I've camped underneath when we had our little magazine. We would go to air shows to sell our little product. In my formative days, I was camping under Fuddy Duddy and Texas Raiders, and we got where we are through the generosity of a lot of people. World War II veterans who held out their hands, pilots, owners of these aircraft, and average history buffs who volunteer for organizations like the CAF. We succeeded really as together as one team, people that would read our stuff and us who would write it. And so I guess ultimately I have there's a lot of fulfillment that comes from being able to live in this Warbird world, to make artwork about these topics, to write books, and to know ultimately that people out there care about it. And so, I can make this product, but really I'm very fortunate, and my thanks ultimately go out to guys like you, Steve, that have supported me over the years, over the decades, and the readers who I will never meet and whose faces I'll never know, but who treasure these books and pass them on and enjoy them, and who go on a Saturday morning and polish a plane at the CAF. We're all fighting the same battle in different ways, and that is a battle against apathy, a battle to remember, and a battle to literally keep them flying. So, and there are sacrifices with that, and your organization knows that, and our heart goes out to, our hearts go out to you, because these were our friends, these were our readers, and in a lot of ways, these guys are our heroes too, because we're all on the same page, but they're the ones who go up in the sky. I just do it from a desk. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Excellent. If people would like to keep track of your exploits, you've got a website, which adammakos.com. You've got a newsletter on there as well.
Steve, the more exciting one is actually the one where you can get the autograph books.
Yes.
My website, I post, here's some behind the scenes stuff, but valorstudios.com is where, if you want to get a book signed by Tom Hudner himself, Tom signed a whole bunch of them when we were touring together. We still have some of them. We've got books signed by a German pilot and a B-17 pilot, like the ones in A Higher Call. So I tell people, go to Valor Studios, check out the signed books there, get somebody the ultimate birthday gift, Christmas gift, keepsake. That's where the good stuff is, valorstudios.com.
All right, Adam, thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us today. We appreciate it. We look forward to your next book, which you say will be coming out probably in about a year or so.
Yeah, I'll go work harder, Steve. Enjoy the chat, and again, thanks to the family out there who have kept me flying.
All right, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. Again, don't forget to click that like, share, or subscribe button and follow us so we can let you know about future shows. As always, if you have ideas for topics or some feedback on our shows you'd like to share with us, we'd love to hear from you. Send an email to leahblock@media@cafhq.org. Again, thanks to our guest, Adam Makos, and his brother Brian for helping put this together. Don't want to forget him. Until next time, from the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Good night.